Hello, in this podcast we're looking at the impact of human population growth. In this podcast we're covering quite a bit. We're looking at the impact of population age structure on growth or decline, and we're looking at what factors influence the size of human populations. We're looking at how human population growth can be slowed, and also the effect that human population growth has on resources and society. So in the last one it's just going to be an overview. The details on that primarily are going to be in later units. First, we'll brief review on the age structure diagrams, and here are the age structure diagrams that were covered in the last podcast. And the industrial level of a country determines its age structure diagram. And third world countries tend to have ones that are like a shallow pyramid, and then when you get more and more advanced, and then we get to post-industrial, we're going to see that you can end up with quite different ones, eventually getting to zero population growth. Now, how do we end up going to something like that? Well, here are some factors that affect the fertility. First is the importance of children as a part of the labor force. And we'll show you a video right now showing children as a part of the labor force.
A second story of child exploitation comes from India today, involving one of the most recognized clothing companies in the world. A factory producing garments for The Gap was raided, and children as young as 10 were found working under terrible conditions. Rohit Gandhi reports from New Delhi.
When police arrived, there was confrontation, commotion, and a mad scramble as children began slipping away. About a dozen social workers charged in. Sitting only in his shorts and without shoes, 10-year-old Sheikh Ali does embroidery here. His days are long and monotonous. I work from 9 a.m. till about 8 p.m. in the evening, says Ali.
In the very same neighborhood where the children were found producing for Gap, many others continue to work in these sweatshops. Today, 14 more were rescued. There are approximately 3,000 sweatshops in Delhi, and 100,000 children still work in them.
Bhuvan Rivu is the director of Save the Children Foundation in Delhi. He says police have been lax in cracking down on sweatshops.
When they accept that there are so many children who are being used for bonded labor who have been trafficked from Bengal, I think there is a lot of scope for police action and law enforcement.
It was the same factory accused of using children to produce clothes for the Gap chain.
Our subcontractor made a decision on his own to illegally subcontract the goods. It is in clear violation of our gapping policy.
The garment industry needs to adopt a system to certify its products are child labor-free, one like that already used by the carpet industry. Rohit Gandhi, CBC News, New Delhi.
So when children are part of the labor force, they're obviously not getting education, and that will definitely affect their having the number of children that they have, and also the types of jobs that they would be getting, and overall quality of the life of that society. Also, the cost of raising and educating children affects fertility. When it was expensive to raise a child, people won't have a lot of children. That's why in the developing world, people tend to have many, many more children, because children are inexpensive. And also, if you look at the next one, availability of pensions, the parents expect children to be able to take care of them in their old age. And if you have many children, odds are that when you're old age, you'll have more children to be able to take care of you. In the developed world, there you have got the retirement systems or pensions or retirement safety nets, and you don't need to. It's not such a concern. Urbanization also affects fertility, as people tend to move into cities, they tend to have fewer children. Also, a big one is educational and employment opportunities for women. We'll get more into that later in the vodcast. Same thing with infant mortality rate. We'll get more into that later in the vodcast. And it is one of the best measures of quality of life. That if you look around in our classroom here in the United States, if they think back in kindergarten of people who you knew, they're probably everybody who you knew, they're still alive today. And that would not be true, say, in your grandparents' day in the United States, and it would and it would not be true in the developing world. Average age of marriage has a huge effect too. Like if someone has a child, say when they are 13 years old, and if someone has a child when they're 26 years old, by the time one has a child when 26, the people who have it when they're 13, that person who is 13 is now a grandparent. And the availability of legal abortions and contraceptives. Not only does that directly bring down the number of children, but also that will allow the women to be able to have a higher quality of life, and by being able to have better educated and have better jobs. Also, religious beliefs, traditions, and cultural norms will bring that number up or bring that number down. Now here we're looking at developing countries. This is stage 1 in the demographic transition model, and we'll get into that in a future slide in this podcast. And this is also called the third world. If you look at the population diagram here, you'll see how this looks, that you have many children at the younger age and also at the earlier part of life, say under 40, and then it rapidly goes down. And this type of population shows very little growth, because most die before age 10. The living conditions in this case are severe. Lesotho here is found in southern Africa, and it's definitely an example of a developing country. And there, as in other places in the third world, food is limited due to poor agricultural techniques, being able to preserve the food, and also due to disease. Developed or post-industrial is the fourth or the last stage of the demographic transitional model, and Japan is an example of that. And you see that you've got a completely different age structure diagram. This doesn't look like a pyramid anymore, and you notice how there are more elderly than children in this case. So in this example of Japan, the population is actually shrinking. In many cases in these countries, the birth rate equals the mortality rate. So like in stage 1, the population rate actually doesn't change. The population stays the same. So how do we transition from pre-industrial to post-industrial? And here is the demographic transitional model. We start off here with stage 1. CBR which is the blue line, is the crude birth rate. CDR is the crude death rate. And you see how both numbers are about equal and high. And the black line is the total population, which is fairly low for a stage 1 or pre-modern or pre-industrial society. Go into stage 2, which that we're going to get into shortly. And in that one, what you see happening is, what's the main change? You see how the birth rate doesn't change, but the death rate does change. It drops. And because the death rate goes down, population starts going up. And then in the stage 3, you notice in stage 3 that now the birth rate starts going down, and the death rate continues to go down and flattens out. Now, because the birth rate is still higher than the death rate, the population is still increasing, but not at the same rate. And then we get to stage 4, birth rate and death rate are at a much lower rate than they were originally, but now they're the same, so that the population now stabilizes again, but it's now at a much higher level. There are more people than there were back in stage 1. Now here is stage 2. This is transitional. And you notice that here you see the population growing like we saw in the graph. So you see here there's a lot at the pre-reproductive age. Those move up, you end up with many more people. Now, what causes this? Well, industrialization starts. Because of this, that brings about many changes. The death rate starts to decrease, and that's due to hygiene, things like washing your hands, and that will make things healthier for the people. And also medical advances start, like being able to vaccinate people so people don't die from childhood diseases. Also sanitation, treating sewage rather than Just rather than just dumping raw sewage straight into the river, it's treated, or disposing of the garbage properly rather than just throwing it out in the streets. Also, clean water, like one of the main killers used to be cholera, which was caused by contaminated water. It was contaminated by feces, and also higher levels of education. And because of all of this, as we saw before in the graph, the population will boom. And then we go to stage 3. Stage 3, you notice that you still have that boom moving up through the population. People who are ages 10 through 19, those children were born in Guyana when they were still probably at stage 2, but from 0 to 10, they were now in stage 3. Why does that birth rate decline? Well, urbanization raises the cost of large families. And because urbanization has raised the cost of large families, people have smaller families. Also, the retirement safety net reduces the need for extra children to support old families, as we discussed earlier. And education and family planning both raise the age that women have their first child, and that will decrease the number of children that they have. Now here is post-industrial, and this one is for a country called Liechtenstein, which is in Europe. And you see here that this one looks like the population is shrinking a little bit because there are fewer children than people who are at age let's say are in the latter part of middle age. But also it looks like while it's shrinking, it's also stabilizing, so it's getting towards zero population growth. I'm not going to repeat myself and go into details of post-industrial. All you have to do is just go back earlier into the podcast where I've gone into this before. So now we're going to some of the effects and factors on population growth. And here's a cover of a Time magazine about a famine in Ethiopia. Why was there a famine in Ethiopia? In this famine, 8 million people were victims, and of those 8 million, 1 million people died. Causes of that, well, one was that there was a severe drought in Ethiopia, and there was also a civil war there at the time. And one thing as a result, eventually that civil war is now Ethiopia was split into two countries. Eritrea broke off and Ethiopia. And as a result of all these millions of people starving to death, the music world had a response, and some of that is reserved, and some of that you can see actually on YouTube. They raised a lot of money through some songs like We Are the World, and there are also some concerts like the Live Aid concert and also something called Band Aid. So just if you want to see those, I definitely recommend it, and you just look for those on YouTube. Population growth can result in hunger. In one sense, this seems a bit strange because the world does produce enough food for everybody, but not everybody can afford it, and also it's not distributed efficiently. One way you see this is that the landowners will export their food to rich countries, and that can contribute to famine at home. And also the following things will contribute to a quarter of the world's population being malnourished. And malnourished, as you know, is one of the main causes of a lot of infant mortality, as well as other ways of increasing the mortality rate. So poverty, droughts, wars, disease, and surpassing carrying capacities all of those will result to a quarter of the world's population being malnourished. Now we come to the effect of disease. And pandemics, first of all, pandemics can increase mortality rate. AIDS is one that we're in right now, and that is its effect is more severe in the third world because treatment of people who have AIDS is expensive. There are two other historical worldwide pandemics that killed many people that you need to know about. One is the Spanish flu of 1918, and that killed more people than World War I. And unlike most regular flus, which will kill either the young or the elderly, the Spanish flu killed people in the prime of their lives, like in their 20s. and there was the bubonic plague of the 14th century that killed up to half the population of Europe. That spread everywhere except the Americas. And the only reason why it didn't spread to the Americas was because this was prior to Columbus. Now, the effective resources. When there's more people, obviously, that constrain the resources. These could be resources in terms of resources that are in the natural settings, like habitats have been destroyed. Think here in New York City. New York City, like Manhattan itself, used to be a place where beavers used to live. There used to be bears. There used to be wolves here. This used to be a fairly wild place. Coney Island, is named after an animal. Coney is a rabbit. So many habitats have been destroyed, have been degraded, driving many species to extinction. Actually, where our school is, this whole area of Springfield Gardens, the drainage here, they have, believe it or not, they actually have to have under Springfield Boulevard here, they have an area to sort of trap the runoff water because just to prevent floods, which we've had here, like the art room that we have back when Springfield Gardens High School was here. That used to be the auto shop, and there was once such a flood that the water literally forced the garage door open, and it came in with such force that it lifted up the car that was in that room and threw it through the wall into the hallway. Now, humans use up about 40% of net primary productivity. Net primary productivity is basically the amount of carbon that are in the producers in plants that can be passed on to the consumers. And also the richest consumers consume most of the resources and produce most of the wastes and most of the pollution. Now, how can we slow the human population growth? The main way that's responsible for more than half of the drop in total fertility rates in developing countries is family planning. Family planning would be things like contraception, would be things like safe legal abortions, and would also be things just like just like the health class that you have in junior high and in high school, and all of those help increase the age that people have their first child and also decrease the number of children that they have. And empowering women is also another important way of slowing human population growth. Because globally, 2/3 of all hours worked are done by women, but women only receive 10% of the world's income, and they own less than 2% of the world's land. You also see another comparison you can see is that poor, illiterate women have 5 to 7 children, while women in literate societies, like here in the United States, have 2 or fewer women. Now we come to our concluding questions. First question, list the 4 stages of demographic transition. Number 2, why does fertility decrease at stage 3? Number 3, why are so many people malnourished? And number 4, why is empowering women so important in slowing human population growth? That concludes this podcast, and I will see you in class tomorrow.